Hi everyone, my name is Enrique Cardona and welcome to another review. This time we're going to talk about a bad movie. Now, I want to go on record to say I love Spider Man. I enjoy the character of Spider Man. He's one of my favorite superheroes. I always love his movies, his cartoons. I already did a review about Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider Man, in which I actually thought that it was a great beginning for that show. Now, we still had a time to see if that show is going to work along the way, but I still willing to give it a chance even if it is under the Disney banner. But here's the thing, just because I love Spider Man doesn't mean that I want to see spin offs about the other characters, especially the villains. And the reason for that is because I don't like when they turn those villains into heroes, or at the very least, into anti heroes. Guys that they are not 100% good, but they still act like noble people. And I'm going to go on record that I also review Venom The Last Dance. And I always said that Venom movies were not perfect, but at the very least, enjoyable as hell, except the last one because it felt like it was getting a little cheap in its story and the effects and everything. But one thing that I know for sure is that despite my problems with The Last Dance, it's at the very least more entertainable than any other movie that I've seen from Sony. And that says a lot. And here's the thing, Sony for many years has tried to make their own cinematic universe with Spider Man in the center. The reason for that is because of the success of the MCU, and because Spider Man is basically the biggest and the best superhero of all time, along with Superman and Batman. Sony decided to create a universe around that character in order to cash in into the cinematic universe, cash grab. And basically, they wanted to turn it into something that a lot of people will enjoy and make a lot of money. And the problem is that they have already tried it like 10 years ago with the Amazing Spider Man 2. That movie suffered because of Sony's meddling because they wanted to create it into a cinematic universe instead of, create stories that people actually enjoy. And that cost them dearly because a lot of things happened and that I'm not even gonna go through it, but basically derail their plans and force them to make a deal with Disney in order to bring Spider-Man into the MCU. And you know what? It was the best thing that could ever happen to them because at the very least, Spider-Man is in the MCU and making everybody rich. But still, Sony, in their desperate attempt to create their own cinematic universe with the Spider Man characters, still decided to make other movies. Now, I already talked about Venom, but there are others that I also mentioned, like Morbius, for example. I already reviewed that movie like a long time ago, and I still stand by the fact that it's still one of the most unnecessary movies of all time, and that it didn't need to exist, or it wasn't not even as scary as they wanted to make it out to be. Worst of all was Madam Web. Although I should clarify that Madam Web is not a villain, it's actually one of Spider Man's biggest allies. Now, I'm going to talk about that movie one day in the future, but needless to say, that movie was terrible, both in effects, acting, ADR voice, and just story. It was just terrible. But of course, there was one that many people refused to watch, even refused to do a red carpet, and that is, of course, Kraven the Hunter. Now, I want to go on record to say that Kraven the Hunter is probably the most vicious villain that Spider Man has ever faced. And that says a lot because he has a lot of villains that want his head on a platter. But Craven is the one who actually sees it as an opportunity for glory and greatness. But before I get into the movie, let's talk about Craven the Hunter itself and what the origin is for this character so you can understand what I think of this movie and its portrayal of the character, or in this case, the villain. Sergei Kravinov, aka Kraven the Hunter, is basically a man who was coming from a rich and wealthy family called the Kravinovs, led by his father Nikolai. They were both residing in Russia, but then eventually there were disasters of war that forced them to live in other parts, forced them to relocate into America. When Craven, for the last few years, spent his entire life crafting his skills as a hunter and a poacher, going into the deep jungles of Africa, hunting and killing every single animal that came in his way, becoming one of the greatest hunters of all time. That's where he made his riches again by becoming the greatest hunter ever made. And of course, let's not forget that he has a relationship with Dmitry Kravinov, or in this case, the Chameleon, which many remember as being one of the Spider-Man's other foes, which can camouflage or become someone else. And in this case, we see that Kraven is basically not only an important villain for Spider Man history, but also one of the most darkest ones. Because he's the man who's obsessed with Spider Man, wants to hunt him down by any means necessary. He even went as far as to bury Spider Man into a grave and then become him, damaging his psychology, which ended up taking his own life. That is the darkest story that Spider-Man has ever told, and that's saying a lot. But needless to say, Kraven the Hunter is one of the most vicious villains that he ever encountered. Now, when the movie was announced and starring Aaron Taylor Johnson, I immediately thought he's way too young to be Kraven the Hunter. Look, don't get me wrong. Aaron Taylor Johnson is one of the greatest actors I've ever seen. I've seen him in Kick Ass as well as seen him as Quicksilver in Age of Ultron. He is a man who can deliver great performances when he's given the right script. But in this case, he's way too young, at least in my opinion, to play Kraven the Hunter. This guy, I always picture it as I don't know, a Gerard Butler or a Henry Cavill. I mean, those guys not only look the physique, but they also look like real professional killers and professional fighters. Those guys could give Spider-Man a run for his money and actually present to be a threat. But in this case, they decide not to do that and instead turn this character into an anti hero. Basically, the movie starts with Craven being a mercenary for killing. He starts going to places, killing people. The last one that we saw in the beginning of the movie was going to a Siberian prison in which he killed a bunch of men who will later become important to the story. Cut to this flashback to when he was a teenager along with his brother Dmitri, in which along with their father Nikolai Kraminov, played by Russell Crowe by the way, they're basically hunting down animals. And one of the things that baffles me about this movie is that they decide to turn Craven, a man who hunts animals, into an animal lover. Basically, he sees a lion, the lion bites him and thinks he's befriended him by looking at his eyes. His father shoots at him. In panic, the lion bites at Kravinov, and then he apparently, and this is something that I still struggle to understand, he somehow the blood of the lion falls down into Craven's wounds, into his blood, and somehow mixed it up with something that the young Calypso is silly, played by Ariana DeBose. It basically gives an elixir or potion that not only saves his life but also balances his human side with his animal side. It's very complicated. I know that it's very hard to distinguish, and I know that Calypso is one of Craven's most recurring characters as well as a love interest because it was because of her that Craven managed to acquire speed and agility and strength. Basically, she's an important part of Craven. But even with that fact, I still think that it was still not only a plot convenience that she was there when Craven was bitten by the lion, but also that she had the elixir that her grandmother gave to her that same day. It's just too much of a plot convenience, if you ask me. But cut to a few days later, Craven gets out of the hospital. He has a confrontation about with his father about the lion. He sees the lion being mounted and taxidermy by his father. He had enough, so he decides to leave, leaving his brother Dimitri behind. Okay, so one of the things that I need to address is that the relationship between Craven and Dimitri is that it's an abusive relationship. And what I mean by that is that those two are not brothers but half brothers. You see, Nikolai had an affair before having a baby with, oh no, after he had a baby with Anna, the mother of Craven, or in this case, the mother of Sergei Kravinov. By the way, I should probably address this before I forget. Anna, or the mother of Craven and Dmitri in this movie, is convicted to an insane asylum in which she takes her own life because her husband Nikolai, drove her insane, and that's just baffling to me to hear. But then again, it's kind of weird to talk about these origins and involving family drama. But needless to say, Craven decides to leave. Sergei basically decides to leave, leaving his brother at the hands of his own father. Cut to a few years later, we see that Craven is now a mercenary for hire and is killing people. We see that Kraven lives in the landfills of Russia where he has his own base in which he not only can hunt for skill as well as for his food, but also defend the animals there from any poacher or any mercenary that goes there. Basically, he's becoming the Tarzan of the Sony Spider-Man cinematic universe, which is a complete betrayal of the character because Kraven doesn't give a F about any form of life. He cares about the sport of hunting. It's just baffling to me, but that's the way they are portraying him in this movie. But yeah, he basically goes on a hunt, kills a bunch of guys, a bunch of mercenaries. One of them he follows back into London, in which he kills them, and coincidentally, that's where he not only he meets Calypso there, who is now a defense attorney or a lawyer. It's like, what? Calypso in the comics is basically a voodoo priestess, a witch that provides Kraven all the potions, which enhances his strength and his abilities as a hunter. But now she's playing a lawyer or a defense attorney in London defending the innocent. Like, what? That's not even remotely connected to Calypso. You couldn't switch it to any other character and it still be the same character that we see in this movie. But Calypso as a lawyer? Like, what? It's just baffling to me. And it definitely doesn't represent the character right. Regardless, I should also mention in these flashback scenes, we also see Alexis Savage, aka the Rhino, played by Alessandro Nivola. And I will say this, even though I was excited to see the Rhino coming back, I gotta be honest, Paul Giamatti as the Rhino was 10 times more dignified than Alessandro Nivola because here's the thing, in this movie, while he's played by a great actor, is basically becoming a laughing joke. This guy in the beginning is basically a poacher who's been seen as a joke, a guy who's not meant to be taken seriously, who's not strong enough. So a few years later, now he is a Russian mercenary or a Russian boss, which basically has a lot of control in both genetics as well as other arm and drug related problems. Basically, he's a crime boss in London and he's hunting down Craven. Now, I'm going to get to why he is the way he is, but basically, Alexei is basically hunting down Craven, which brings us to Sergey, or in this case, Craven, meeting Dmitri again after a long time being further apart. The two brothers trying to reconcile their past, talk about their father, the abuse they endured, and everything, which resulted in Dmitri being the cross eyes of Alexis Savich's organization and wanting to get Kraven into his organization. So he captures him. He captures Dmitri. Kraven goes on the hunt to save his brother, and eventually he misses it. So he has to require the help of Callisto in order to get Alexei and as well as getting his own brother Dimitri. Now, other characters appear, and like in this case, Christopher Abbott, who plays the Marvel character The Foreigner. The Foreigner is basically a Punisher like assassin with the powers of speed, and basically, he has been one of the few villains, obscure villains from the Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery. Now, seeing him feels underwhelming. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, seeing the Foreigner gives me the thought or the mindset of an opportunity to have Spider-Man being hunted down by all sorts of villains in the cinematic universe. Being hunted down by the Foreigner, that could be great, and it could explore the abilities of Spider-Man as well as the Foreigner and why he does the hunting. But in this case, he's just another mercenary hired by the Rhino. And there's a reason why he calls himself the Rhino. I'll get to that in a moment. But basically, Nikolai decides not to pay the ransom for his own son, putting him in odds with Kraven again. But he doesn't appear that much in the movie. He basically appears in the flashback and in a few key scenes. But those scenes are barely even worth to muster about. They're not very great, and they're not exactly earth-shattering. During this film, we see that Alex is talking to Dimitri about who he is and why he's doing all this. Well, you see, after the events of the flashback in the movie, Alexei went to New York where he met, get this, Miles Warren. Yes, that Miles Warren, the man who became the Jackal, the man who cloned Spider-Man multiple times, the man who basically decided to become a villain because he had a crush on Gwen Stacy. That Miles Warren. He's mentioned in this movie as the man who gave abilities to Alexis Savage. In this case, he gave him a special hybrid serum in which he can turn into a literal rhino hybrid. Basically, that's why he's called a rhino, because he's basically turning into a hybrid rhino. Now, I'm not gonna pretend that I know very much about Alexi as well as the rhino's origin because it has been switched all around. Sometimes he's a muscle-headed bound goon who doesn't know how to count and basically goes into the hunting and gain money and becomes a super rhino. And by the way, the rhino's origin has always been flip-flopped. One day in the original comics, he's basically a man who gets an enhanced suit that is unbreakable and has the form of a rhino. And the Ultimate Comics is basically a man who's going around in a power suit, in a mechanical robot suit that is very rhino-esque. And now, which one do I prefer better? Well, I normally prefer the one in which he not only gets an enhanced suit, but it's also technologically advanced, like they did in the Spider-Man video game adaptations. I will say that I prefer the mechanical rhino suit, but that's just me. In other versions of the game, he's also an enhanced rhino hybrid, which is something that they took inspiration for this movie. But the less said about that, the better. No, actually, that's a lie. I need to talk about it at the end of the movie. Basically, after a lot of punch times, Alexei convincing Dimitri to join his organization, and after a few things happening in between Craven and Callisto being hunted down by none other than Alex's men, he finally decides to take the fight to him and basically goes back to his home where his cat, or at the very least, his kind of tiger, Daima, who is very much an animal pet that Kraven owns in the comics. Basically, he and Callisto prepare themselves to get to Alexei. So the final battle is basically Kraven fighting not only Rhino but also the Foreigner. The Foreigner throws at him a bunch of serums or tranquilizers, which is kind of like a fear gas, and then he starts seeing a bunch of spiders crawling around Kraven. I don't know why. Is establishing that he's afraid of spiders in order to tie him up with Spider-Man. Like, they never established it before in the movie, or at least I don't recall him being afraid of spiders. This is a guy who hunts down killer animals and killer mercenaries. Like, you mean to tell me that this guy can actually be afraid of spiders when they could be his allies? Like, what is going on here? But in the end, the foreigner is killed by Callisto because Callisto now knows how to shoot arrows now. And even though they established that she knew how to how to hunt with arrows before and bows, it's pretty much out of nowhere in this case. It still feels like out of nowhere. But basically, the final confrontation comes down to Kraven and Rhino. They fight each other. Rhino becomes a ugly CGI Rhino, which not even goes to be big and strong or even resembling to the ones that we see in the comics or in the cartoons. So in the end, basically, Craven fights him, and it looks like Craven is going to fall until he sees the weakness, which is the serum that Alexei injects himself in order to prevent himself to becoming a big size rhino, and in the end, he ended up killing him. So yeah, they killed the rhino in his first appearance. So I don't think he's going to be a Spider-Man villain in the near future. But yeah, needless to say, after that, Craven goes to see his father, who's in the middle of a hunt, takes away his bullets while they were in a conversation, and then he lets his father Nikolai to get being hunted down and killed by a bear. So yeah, basically, Craven kills his own father. He kills Alexis Savage. So everything is good, right? Well, as it turns out, his brother Dimitri goes to visit Miles Warren and becomes the chameleon instead, and basically puts the brothers in odds now. Basically, trying to pay off the whole relationship between them, and it feels so unsatisfying. In fact, seeing the CGI face of the chameleon doesn't make me smile, it just makes me cringe. And in the end, Craven gets his father's best, a lion type vest that we see in the comics, and then poses down in front of a mirror. But instead of being a moment of dramaticness in seeing that he cannot ever escape his father's shadow, it looks like he's posing for a magazine cover or for the poster for a movie. And boy, let me tell you, that was Kraven the Hunter, and it definitely disappoints. It's not like it's the worst movie of all time. In fact, my father saw this movie in theaters. Yeah, I know. But basically says that he actually enjoys this movie because it feels like it is the story of a man trying to escape the father's abuse, and how brothers in arms trying to find a way out of the abusive relationship with a father. But still, even if with those things said, this could have been a great story of dealing with Craven's origin and how he became from a simple guy to an insane killer. And man, this story just makes him into an anti hero. He loves animals, he can communicate with animals. Now, the Craven that I know from the comics, as well as in the video games, that they actually, believe it or not, the video game versions of Spider-Man right nowadays portray Craven in a much, much, much better life than this movie has. Because Craven is actually showing that he cares about the hunting. He kills and kills. Not only that, he kills the majority of the villains in the video game of Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery. He doesn't care as long as he can get Spider-Man. And more importantly, they give him a reason why he's hunting down Spider-Man and why he wants to basically hunt down the biggest prey. And I'm not gonna give it away, but it deals a lot with Kraven's psychology as a hunter because this is basically the law of the jungle. You kill or you be killed. Kill, be killed. And in this movie, they don't portray that. It's basically an origin story for a man who wants to escape his father's abuse, wants to take down organizations, and basically becomes afraid of the animals. And that's just disappointing for me. Now, with that said, what happened after this movie came out? Well, considering that this was one of the worst movies that Sony has produced in a few years, especially considering about the Spider-Man characters, it prompted not only to not have a red carpet display or a red carpet premiere, but also it started the rumors that maybe Sony can sell Spider-Man's assets back to Marvel and to Disney. Now, I don't know if it's going to happen until I see the sign Sony finally sells all the assets of Spider-Man to Disney and Marvel. I will never be able to stay calm. And honestly, I don't doubt they're gonna do it anytime soon because despite all the reception that Craving has, despite all the reception that Man Web and Morbius and Venom have, don't forget they still have Spider-Man, and don't you forget we still have the Spider-Verse movies, which in turn had developed a lot of love for the fans and it pushed Sony to make more of these movies. Now, with that being said, if this is going to be the end of the Sony Spider-Man cinematic universe, then it's better that they do it now and they stop it right here. No more movies about the web slingers, foes, and their origin, or any other C-list character from the Marvel Cinematic Universe that they own the rights to. If this is the end of their cinematic universe, then just cut all your losses and just focus on Spider-Man movies, whether it's with Tom Holland or any other actor, or focus on the Spider-Verse movies. I don't know. Keep making the deal with Disney and Marvel so you can make more movies with the web slinger and keep the villains as villains. You can make them sympathetic, you can make them very relatable, but you still need to make them as villains because they are the representations of Spider Man, their inner struggles and their foes. That's what they are meant to do. And you can involve them. There is nothing wrong with that. But you have to make them into villains. Don't just make them into anti-heroes unless you have a good character progression like the Sandman. No, you have to keep the structure and the core of the character intact, and then maybe eventually you can evolve them. But that's just a big if. But I don't know. Will Sony learn his lesson finally and stop making spin offs of these characters? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe someone at the studio will say, you know what, we can still make money about these characters. Let's keep making them. I don't know. I honestly don't know. All I can tell you is that Craven is not a good movie. Even though my father likes it, and I'm sure a lot of people will like it, for its R-rated content and its action sequences. The action sequences, on the other hand, they're not bad, but they're still a lot of silly. The scene in the castle is especially uh, insane because it's seeing Craven sneaking in and the guards don't notice him, and basically he's walking around behind them and and they don't turn around, or they turn around but they don't look down to see any noise. And oh my god, this movie can be a little dumb sometimes. Like I said, it's not the worst. It's not worse as Man and Web, but it's still bad. There's also ADR voice here and it's off as hell, but it's not as bad as they do with Man and Web. Boy, after all this time, I need to talk about Man and Web one day because boy, did I have some thoughts about that movie. But regardless, I gotta ask the question. What do you think about Kraven the Hunter? Do you still think this is a bad movie? Do you have a soft spot for this movie? Or do you honestly don't care and just want to watch a silly action movie starring Aaron Taylor Johnson as a killer machine who befriends animals? I don't know. Leave your comments in the section below. But yeah, in my opinion, I don't like this movie, and I'm glad I never saw it in theaters. But in any case, I've been Enrique, and I see you guys next time. Peace.